In October of 1997, a 15-year-old boy named John Hartman was beaten to death on the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska. 4 young men, 3 of them Athabascan Indians, were convicted of his murder. Yet years later, the case remains open and unsolved. Who's responsible? And how many killers were out on the streets that night? Was racism to blame for these convictions? I'm your host, Matt Ralston, and this is the story of John Hartman and the Fairbanks Four, case of murder on ice. I haven't talked to many people that think Chris Stone killed his friend John Hartman, but most everyone believes he knows something, given that he was seen walking with his friend 15 minutes before his fatal beating, and directly after he stormed into a local grocery store, apparently in a state of shock and confusion. But Chris Stone was never seriously interrogated by detectives or considered much of a suspect. Now this is truly mind-boggling, some kind of incomprehensible oversight. Here's actual audio of Chris's interview with Detective Aaron Ring. You'll notice the tone is much different than when he interviewed, say, George Freese or Eugene Vent. He's not presenting false evidence. He's not hounding him. He's not telling him that he's guilty and he knows it. He's really barely even asking him what happened, even though it seems pretty obvious, even to an outside observer, that he was probably there. He's being friendly, kind, like a school counselor. Now, this audio is hard to make out. I just want you to get a feel for the vibe, how Ring is being gentle with him.
Your friend, John, do you have any money on him? Walks away?
No, we're all broke.
You didn't have anybody pay the cash or anything?
Oh, no. EJ, spends lots of his money on the cab.
Okay. Does he carry a wallet with him?
Not that I know of.
He didn't have a wallet with him.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
In fact, it took us most of the day to figure out who he was. I suppose we can get the exact times. And you think you got to EJ sometime between 12:30 and 1?
We left around, we probably got there about 1 o'clock, 1:30, so around that.
Chris Stone just told Detective Ring that he was with John Hartman at the time of the attack. Next, Ring presses him. Kind of.
You're not just afraid?
I'm not afraid, no. I would come out.
Because that's the information we had, that you might have been with him when he was assaulted.
Yeah.
That's all that happened. We're threatened by these guys.
Yeah.
Detective Ring just told Chris Stone that he has information. People saying that Chris Stone was there at the scene of the attack. Do you think he's just making this up? Or do you think he actually does have that information? I'm not sure.
Now, if you had been witness to this, and for whatever reason, fear or embarrassment or whatever, you didn't tell us right away, you wouldn't tell us now, you wouldn't be in any trouble. Do you understand that? You wouldn't be in any trouble for not coming forward with that. So I understand that. Okay. I just want to be clear that if you saw any of this, that you talk with me about it.
Okay.
For the sake of your facts.
No.
All right. Are you sure there's nothing else that we need to discuss here?
Yeah, I'm sure. You see nothing?
Well, I'm just having a hard time figuring this out, though, because that's the information I have, that you were there.
I wasn't.
And not a participant, but, threatened and forced to stay there and stuff like that. And then,
No, I wasn't.
It's totally inexplicable why Detective Ring is treating Chris Stone with such deference. He doesn't push him at all. Remember, in a previous episode, as Chris was interviewed for his part in taping a girl's arms together before his friend raped her, When he's asked if he gets scared, he says, "I was scared when my friend died." Now, was that an admission? I understand being shocked, upset, confused. But why would he really be scared unless there was some clear and present danger? Chris didn't see John Hartman in the hospital. He wasn't there when he passed away. So when is he referring to? This statement was kept from the defense of the Fairbanks Four, uncovered many years later. Yet, Detective Ring knew about it. So it seems maybe whoever beat up John Hartman could have been after Chris Stone. See, weeks prior, Chris had been beaten up so badly he required a visit to the hospital. An employee at the Fort Knox gold mine, which is about 20 miles northeast of Fairbanks, noticed him walking down the highway, hitchhiking, battered, bloody. The employee came to his aid. Police were called, but Chris didn't cooperate with them. He refused to name whoever had roughed him up, saying, quote, "It will just happen again." One would think Aaron Ring would want to know anything about a guy or group of guys who were administering severe beatdowns, particularly to the friend of the victim who was with him right before he was beaten to death. But apparently this never came up. Recently, John Hartman's older brother, Sean Kelly, best friend of Filthy Fuhr, had ripped off a major cocaine dealer in the town of Fox, which is just outside of Fairbanks on the same highway as the Fort Knox gold mine, where Chris Stone had been found walking. Sean Kelly thought that the two beatings may be connected. Maybe his little brother had been beaten to death in retaliation for his own reckless behavior. Riddled with guilt, Sean Kelly urged police to look into this, but apparently nothing came of it. Another curious fact that no one can really make heads or tails of is that John Hartman, when he was found on the sidewalk, was wearing Chris Stone's pants. Blue corduroys, much too big for John Hartman's skinny frame. Chris Stone testified that Hartman was wearing these the entire day, that he had them on when he went to meet him at the McDonald's that morning. But John Hartman's mom remembers him wearing camouflage pants when the pair ducked into Lucky Aces, the pull-tab parlor where she worked. So do many others, including their friend E.J. Stevens, who was with them at their babysitting rave at Noah's Rainbow Inn. E.J. Stevens had bought these blue corduroys for Chris Stone. Chris said he would pay him back. Yeah, good luck with that. I'm wondering if this goes back to that issue of control that frequently comes up regarding Chris Stone, taping a girl's arms together, giving his friend John Hartman a huge batch of Wellbutrin, answering questions for him. These are all control issues. Maybe the pants were as well. Hey, EJ, buy me these pants, bitch. It's just really strange. Why would John Hartman be wearing Chris Stone's pants? He would have to change after they left Noah's Rainbow Inn, taking a short cab ride and being dropped off 15 minutes before Hartman's attack. Where would he have even changed into them? On the street? And why? Maybe he had pissed himself while having a seizure and didn't realize it until they had left? That's all I can think of, but where did the pants even come from? Maybe they mean nothing, but it deserves noting that Chris Stone's account of the pants differs from everyone else's. Why? But the pants are of great importance, since it was alleged that John Hartman had been sexually assaulted, and 2 of the Fairbanks Four were convicted of his sexual assault. There are 2 schools of thought on this. Some think that John Hartman was actually not sexually assaulted, and this was only presumed because, as he was found lying on the ground, his pants were down around his knees. It's important to remember that he was wearing Chris Stone's pants, that Chris Stone outweighed John Hartman by maybe 70 pounds. So, of course, the pants might fall down. But there was credible evidence that Hartman had been sexually assaulted. Even though his underwear was found intact, at the hospital he was evaluated by a sexual assault examiner who found a large, deep tear on him in his nether regions, as well as some abrasions 3 to 4 inches inside of him. So, did someone desecrate his lifeless body? Or assault him before he was beaten? Chris Stone would be charged with an unrelated sex crime. And there's that whole issue of control I keep thinking about, of dominating someone. But maybe, and I'll have to tread lightly here because John Hartman isn't here to answer, but maybe he was engaging in consensual homosexual behavior. A girl named Brandy Hudspeth was 15 years old at the time. She'd been living with 2 guys named Dale Depew and Sean Aldrich. These guys were tough young guys, gangsters or wannabe gangsters. Brandy remembers the night of John Hartman's assault specifically because it was Dale Depew's birthday. She would later testify at an evidentiary hearing for the Fairbanks Four, prompted by the work of the Alaska Innocence Project, that Dale Depew and Sean Aldrich left their house that night with 1 or 2 other guys to go get some money. She assumed they meant beating people up. Remember, this is permanent fund dividend time when people are walking around with all that cash. She says they came back home with $160 and were talking about, quote, knocking heads that night. Dale Depew, Sean Aldrich, and one of their buddies named John Holloway would be convicted of beating a guy and slitting his throat in an incident that happened in August the following year. They were riding in a cab, and apparently the driver made some inappropriate sexual remarks to one or more of the females who were also in the car. Sean Aldrich then showed the driver a photo of his sister, which he carried in his wallet, which may or may not be creepy, and the driver said some additional pervy things about his sister. He dropped them off, but the crew made plans to meet him again later that night. Dale Depew told the driver that he had a friend in a nearby cabin where he could score some cocaine. As they were walking through the woods to get to this cabin, the 3 men jumped him, beat him till he was nearly dead, slit his throat. They took his cab and submerged it in a local river. His body was not discovered until several months later by a hiker, and it should be noted that this driver was kicked multiple times. And John Holloway taught Taekwondo to these guys. Of further note, during the first of the Fairbanks Four trials, Chris Stone testified that the guys who hospitalized him, reportedly beating him with billiard balls stuffed into socks, included someone named Dale Depew. Chris was mumbling through his lips, apparently mispronouncing Dale Depew's name. Chris Stone also testified in favor of John Holloway during his trial for killing the cab driver, which began right around the same time as Eugene, the youngster's trial. Given that these guys had vindictively beaten up anyone, might warrant further investigation in its relevance to John Hartman. But the fact that they'd beat up his friend, Chris Stone, who was with him that night, would have obviously, or should have obviously, sounded all kinds of alarms. But Detective Ring apparently never pursued it seriously. When asked on the witness stand, he said the cases were not connected, and asked if he pursued suspects other than the Fairbanks Four. He said no again. Only, quote, Initially other friends of Eugene's, names he had given me that had turned out to be false, that sort of thing. So only people somehow associated with these 4 boys, he was asked? Yes, he said. Jesus, man, pull your head out of your ass. Detectives, when they believe they have the right suspect, can sometimes shut everything else out, growing narrow-minded, not wanting to hear anything that doesn't confirm their own existing beliefs. But this is just ridiculous. I mean, was Aaron Ring just incompetent? Or was there something nefarious going on? Was he conspiratorial? Was he some kind of racist? Did he have a vendetta against the native community? I don't know. I'm not suggesting that. Even if he did, I don't think he'd want to frame 4 guys for murder. I think it's just a case of believing what you want to believe, hearing what you want to hear. And there was incentive to not want to seek out additional suspects, to muddy the waters, because there was public pressure to nail the killer or killers, to charge them quickly, as this was a high-profile case that shook the community. And indeed, the suspects were charged within 36 hours, and Aaron Ring secured 4 murder convictions. It's still nearly impossible to fathom why he wouldn't want to talk to Dale DePue about this. I tried to talk to him about this, but he doesn't want to talk. He's a car salesman now in Alaska, so if you're ever in the market, want to support a guy that just killed someone for the hell of it, I'd look him up. While the alibis of the Fairbanks Four are fairly strong, multiple people testifying they were there with them around or during the time of the Hartman attack, they are fallible. These guys were all, with the possible exception of Marvin, who appeared to be at the wedding reception at that time, driving from a party to the reception, or walking downtown about a mile away. Could they have been at the scene of the crime and their friends were covering for them? What if in some horrific scene, people took turns beating John Hartman's lifeless body the entire night as he lay there? Certainly, it appears there were multiple groups of dangerous dudes out that night. Besides Frank Dayton and John Hartman, there were other attacks as well. At 12:15 a.m., an elderly native man was witnessed being assaulted downtown. The perps were described as 3 African-American men. The suspects escaped. Later that night, a guy named Don Moses was accosted by 4 guys who were primed to jump him. He says he was frightened, that his life flashed before his eyes, that his goose may have been cooked. But as they approached him, they retreated, scared away by the sound of police sirens. And he stated that these 4 guys were not George, Eugene, Kevin, or Marvin. As the trials loomed, the state really appeared to have a lack of evidence connecting the Fairbanks Four to the beating. They had confessions from George and Eugene, but the defense would argue they could never have been at the scene of the crime. George was walking with friends. Eugene and Kevin were in a car, 15 minutes away. They had the testimony of Arlo Olson, identifying them as having mugged Frank Dayton and jumping into Marvin's blue Dodge Shadow. But they had virtually no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. So what were they going to do? Well, they had to get creative. The famous boot exhibit would become notorious in this case. Remember, George had gone to the emergency room the morning after the attack with a badly sprained ankle that he thought was broken. It was quickly surmised by the hospital staff that this may be connected to the John Hartman beating, as he had boot marks on his face. The photos are difficult to look at. His entire face is swollen. His lip is split open. The side of his face is covered in deep, open wounds that tore into the skin. His head has been shaved to allow access to the wounds on his scalp. He has a breathing tube. It's not a good scene. The prosecution decided that George's foot and these photos would play a central role in their case. And so, in court, they produced an exhibit. It was a picture of John Hartman's badly beaten face, and to be flipped over it were different transparencies of various boot treads. The goal was to match George's boot to the marks on Hartman's face. Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory read a 6-inch ruler positioned alongside the tread impressions spanning the overlay of the exhibit's top see-through layer. There's much debate as to the scientific merit, if any, of matching up boot marks to the wounds on a victim's face. Reading bruises is far more complex than matching other kinds of prints, said Jim Wolfe, a criminalist who worked for the state's medical lab and was a supposed expert on lab prints. When a boot leaves an impression in mud or blood or whatever, what you see is kind of a direct reflection, he said. But with skin damage through a blow, the bruise reflects not only the shape of the forceful object, but also exhibits a pinching effect of underlying bones, fluids, and tissue. And this is especially true on a face, said Jim Wolfe. And if you just think about it in simple terms, how could you match a boot to the marks on someone's face? It seems like a bit of a stretch. I mean, it's just so imprecise. There's a big wound, and boots are boots. What can an expert tell any more than just a regular person? Yeah, looks like he got kicked in the face. All right. This exhibit, which had the words Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory printed on it, didn't actually come from the Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory, as you or a jury would assume. Now, this is really out there, but it's a fact that came out later that Detective Aaron Ring and prosecutor Jeff O'Brien, the attorney for the prosecution, made the exhibit. Like they constructed it themselves in a hotel room before the trial, like a school science project. I really want to know how, like if they went to Michael's Arts and Crafts or a Kinko's. I don't have the information, but I know that these men made the exhibit and pawned it off as being legitimate. So despite the fact that it had the word scientific on it, it wasn't actually scientific. Detective Ring and prosecutor Jeff O'Brien had manipulated the photographs of George's boot soles, enlarging them to more accurately reflect the wounds on John Hartman's face. Frank Fallico, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alaska, this exhibit falling under his purvey, testified at the trial and waffled when confronted with this revelation. A quick aside, Frank was in the movie Grizzly Man, about that bear enthusiast named Timothy Treadwell, who was killed by bears after attempting to live in harmony with them in Alaska. It's a great film if you haven't seen it. It's really funny. Frank is in this film. He's the medical examiner, so he performed the autopsy on Timothy Treadwell's body. And on camera, he appears to be comedically insane, as though he's way too thrilled to be cutting people open. He's all googly-eyed and seemingly depraved. He's very, very weird, which is why I assume Werner Herzog featured him in the movie. There could be an argument that's unrelated to me, said Fallico in a February 2007 interview about the boot exhibit, about whether one should make that kind of exhibit. Whether a laboratory person, a criminalist, is the one to do it, and anyone else who does it is somehow or another committing an act that is not quite valid scientifically. He elaborated, these things relate to a standard of proof that's suggestive of, I didn't say consistent with, and I didn't say pathognomonic of, which to me would be higher standards of proof. Okay, guy, you'd think that if you're sending people to prison, you'd want everything to be consistent. And using big words like pathognomic don't make you more intelligent. What Frank Falco is saying is that he didn't blow the whistle on a totally bogus exhibit. Neglect is another word for that, but I'll try and find a thesaurus. And suggestive of should never be considered a valid standard, not in a court of law. My basketball skills are suggestive of that of LeBron James. Yes, they are. But I'm not sure they're consistent with. Detective Ring also showed the court a diagram that he made of the corner of 9th Avenue and Barnett Street, where John Hartman was found. He said Eugene, the youngster, accurately placed an X on the southwest corner of the intersection, indicating the location of the beating. It didn't come up in court, but the moment in Eugene's interrogation, when he reportedly marked this X, wasn't recorded. And many thought that maybe Detective Ring had placed the X there himself and gave Eugene credit for it. Eugene's interrogation was being recorded, as is the law in Alaska. But that moment where he marked the X was not. Yes, at that moment, Aaron Ring's recorder ran out of tape. Again. The Fairbanks Four continued to languish in prison. At points, they were transferred to Arizona and Colorado, as the state of Alaska had contracted with private prisons to house their felons. There were clearly some serious issues with their case. In one instance, a jury decided to, without the knowledge of the judge, create an experiment. They went outside in the daylight and paced off what they took to be the distance in which Arlo Olson had identified the Fairbanks Four. It's unclear how far they measured, but it was significantly less than the 550 feet at which Arlo had spied the perpetrators. It was also daylight, and they were identifying people who they'd just seen up close. The fact that the jurors did this behind the judge's back, it was decided, was grounds for a new trial. But this was rejected on appeal. When it was discovered that the prosecuting attorney and the detective in the case had manufactured evidence, this was seen as grounds for a new trial as well. But nothing changed, and of the Fairbanks Four, all but Marvin Roberts, the frontman, had exhausted their appeal processes. But now, all these years later, there were rumors going around. More and more rumors. That some guy in prison might have told some people that him and his friends murdered John Hartman. This was a bombshell, but still, the guy sat in prison day after day after day. This is Jade Frank. She's from Fairbanks. We went to school together. While attending the University of Alaska Fairbanks, she took a few journalism courses and was studying the John Hartman case. Spring break rolled around, and she went to Tucson to meet some friends and eventually take a trip to Mexico. She realized that she'd be only about an hour away from the private prison where George Freese, Eugene Vint, and Marvin Roberts were being held. As part of her project, she went to go interview them. I remember when this happened, when I was, I think 15, yeah. And it was on the news and stuff, but did you remember it? Were you familiar with it before you, had to study it?
I was not like intimately familiar with it, but I did remember it happening, like you said, because I think maybe I was like a year older than Hartman when it happened. And I remember it was like a big story. It was big news, and it was kind of shocking or scary to like think about, you know, somebody getting attacked like that. That was, you know, our age. But I don't remember really thinking much more about it, you know?
Yeah, same with me. I mean, my family didn't really sit around a dinner table talking about stuff. And I don't know. I don't remember kids our age talking about it, whereas maybe we should have. I mean, imagine with, you know, Facebook and Instagram, maybe, you know, it would have been a lot more of a buzz around town.
Yeah. Or maybe if he had gone to, maybe if I went to the same school, maybe it would have been a bigger impact. But yeah. So like I recalled the story. So I remember, you know, when I learned about like really digging into the case, I remember thinking like, oh, well, that's interesting because I remember that case, you know, I remember that happening. And then I started to dig into it and learn about it, and learn about what happened. And the story kind of like, you know, unfolded for me. And had a chance to meet them. And then, you know, I started talking about it with other people. I started talking about it with my parents. I started talking about it with my parents' friends. And they recalled this story in a lot more detail. I think probably because they were adults, not kids, you know, obsessed with themselves at the time when it happened. And for my parents and for my parents' friends, their reaction was like, oh yeah, well, you know, those native boys that killed him. And I started, you know, trying to explain and trying to bring them along, to kind of question the details of the story. And, you know, I have a pretty like conservative family, and my mom, she worked for the Fairbanks Correctional Center, and, you know, worked closely with law enforcement, and has, I think, you know, probably a lot of respect, like a lot of people do, and trust in law enforcement. And so it's been kind of interesting to see, like for her and for others, their journey as the story has unfolded, as they've learned more details through me, I've coming around to see and to question things that they hadn't before. Because I think, you know, in cases like this, people are quick to judge, quick to, you know, put it off on someone, especially someone who, you know, maybe represents a group of people or a community that they're not familiar with, or that they have preconceptions about, and, you know, eager for there to be just some closure, just kind of accept the truth as they hear it, and move on and not question it again. And I think for me, that experience like really taught me to question and to not just take something at face value as I hear it from law enforcement or from the media, because there's always other sides to a story, you know?
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting way to look at it, I guess, because race and class, you know, all four of these guys were poor, basically. Kevin's
dad had been murdered the year before. I know that Marvin and George, and I'm not sure about, I think Eugene as well, like they all had, their families were separated. They went to jail. Marvin was the only one that could post bail or hire a lawyer, and that's just because the town of, is it Tanana that his family's from, I think? You know, they rallied behind him to raise money. But
Yeah.
so did you know that, because I don't know if I should be embarrassed, not really, because you learn new things every day, but when I read that, when I started researching this case a few months ago, I read that they were in prison in Arizona, and I was like, I had to read it a couple of times. It's like, what do you mean they're in prison in Arizona? I had no idea that states contract with each other to private prisons to.
Yeah. It kind of set in when I started driving there, and when I got into the town and actually went to the prison. I think that's where my fear kind of started to set in.
Totally like middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very strange place. So I had no preconceptions about what to expect about. I'd never heard of Florence, but I was like, okay, it's just some town in Arizona, you know. Looked it up on the map, probably like MapQuested it. I don't know, this was like 2004. So I didn't have like, you know, an iPhone or anything. And, you know, I had to rent a car. I went by myself. Also, my professors had made me promise that I was going to dress in the baggiest clothes I could find. They told me, like, you know, don't wear any makeup and try to make yourself look like as unattractive as possible. You don't want to attract any attention when you go in there. They were like worried about me, I think, probably as a young woman going there and
about actually getting like accosted or something.
No, I think maybe just being harassed. I'm not sure. They just seemed concerned about me, and they wanted to make sure that I was that I wasn't going to maybe put myself in a more uncomfortable situation than necessary. So,
right.
So I dressed in these clothes and I rented this car and I got in the car, and then I remember as I took like the exit off the freeway into the town, there's like these signs that were warning against picking up hitchhikers, which I thought was odd. I'd never seen a sign like that before entering a town. So that was kind of strange.
Had you ever picked up a hitchhiker before that?
You know, I think I have in Alaska, but that's kind of different, right?
Yeah, I mean there are serial killers in Alaska, but
that's true.
Yeah, I used to pick them up on the Parks Highway and take them to
the Parks Highway. Yeah. I didn't get to see a lot, but I'm trying to recall, you know, the conversations that I had with the guys about what life was like there, because they've been moved around a few times, you know, and this was a place that they had been. I think they had not been there too long. I think they had recently been moved there from somewhere else, maybe Colorado. I can't remember exactly what the previous prison that they had been to. Because from my understanding, like Alaska would outsource its prison population to, like, let's say Colorado, because that's cheaper. And then Colorado would outsource those prisoners to Arizona. So these guys were just kind of getting shuffled around. And I think what really struck me was knowing how far I had come to be there from Fairbanks, right? I probably took 2 or 3 flights. I had to rent a car. And so I was just imagining how far away and isolated they were from their families, you know, because as you said, it's, you know, coming from families with maybe not a lot of means. How could they visit them? You know, how could they afford to go visit and see them? So they're pretty far away from home too. They seemed happy to talk to me. And they were very warm and, generous with me with their time and with their responses.
What did you get a sense that they were, because I know they had in your interviews, it's and in the videos too, but it's hard to tell if they were a little bit downtrodden. I mean, obviously, like I would think I would get depressed in prison, like no matter the circumstances. But did you? Because I think I remember George saying he just kind of hangs out, but and it's just hard to tell if they were like kind of depressed or if you do fall into a routine. I have no idea.
Yeah. No, I asked them some questions about that because I think while my primary objective was to get some clarity and information about some of the details of the case, I think my own curiosity kind of took over in terms of wanting to understand what it was like to be them there. And, I think once I met them and started talking to them too, you start to kind of see yourself in them, right? Especially being people my age from my hometown and trying to imagine myself in their shoes and in their situation was pretty hard. So I remember asking them some questions about what they do with their time and, if they're bitter about things, like if they have any hope, and they all had kind of different responses, and different experiences. I think the one thing I remember them all sharing is that they stay pretty close together, the three of them, in terms of, keeping their hope in their relationships, close in terms of their kind of shared experience in this trial and being kind of, pulled together into this circumstance unwillingly. And so kind of helping each other through that experience. Marvin, I remember, just struck me. He was so spiritual, and just had this sort of deep conviction that God was going to see them through this situation, and that that they were gonna come out of this. And he just had this deep faith in that happening. And at the time, I remember thinking God, how, after all these years and after all that's happened to you, how could you be hanging on to that faith?
What did you, after all this, after you got back and, eventually you moved on from the story, it didn't become your life, obviously. But what did you take away from it? Were you convinced of a certain of their innocence, of their guilt? Do you not know, from being immersed in it to a degree and just being very informed on it? Did you form a hard opinion?
I did. When I started the project, I didn't really have an opinion. When I started reading all of the materials, my opinion started forming around the fact that, okay, whether or not these guys did it, they were convicted on little to no evidence. And I think in particular with some of the truths that emerged around the eyewitness, around some of the experiments. I think that the journalism students had uncovered that the jurors had did some experiments, and
they did. So Arlo Olson identified the guys from 550 feet away. The jurors, it must have been a lunch break or something, took it upon themselves to go out on the street during the day
in broad daylight, right,
and
to see if they could ID each other, who they already knew, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I think what I learned through just reading all of the research and the information that had been gathered by the investigative journalism class, I began to really question. I really questioned things, and again, I would say didn't have like strong certainty one way or the other whether or not they did it. But what I knew at that point was, well, that maybe was kind of not the point here, because there was no evidence that really tied them to this crime. And then meeting them in person, face to face, I started to really see them and understand them as people. I started to see them as community members of mine. I remember thinking, like, these are guys that I could have been friends with. Some of them reminded me of people that I knew. And I also could have been in a situation like that. I mean, I think a lot of kids in Fairbanks get into trouble, right? I got into trouble. I mean, we all kind of, there's not a lot to do in Fairbanks.
There's not much else to do. No.
So I could really empathize with their situation, except that I was a privileged white person, and so I could get away with getting into trouble.
This is George.
It's the worst that could happen to anybody, especially for this amount of time.
Are you better about it?
Yes, I'd have to say I do have better feelings toward the judicial system and everybody that was involved in doing this. Yes.
Have you learned, or have you tried to accept any of it, or?
Not really. I mean, it's just a lot easier now. I mean, this place is almost home. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Here she is talking to Eugene.
It's messed up, it hurts, because I know my family out there, they need me. My mom, she used to be doing real bad, and now she's doing real good though. And she's got the kids, and when I came in there, she was a baby and stuff, but now when I see them and I talk to them, they're always asking, when are you coming home? It's kind of hard, but it's really messed up. But getting stronger, really strong through all this. Me and George.
Yeah.
It's hard though.
Are you bitter at all?
Yeah, a little bit. Mostly because I know Ring, I think he only used this to move up the ladder. But I guess he was just doing his job out there.
This is Marvin.
Oh man, it's after 6.5 years, it's still a bad feeling, It's just like a couple of days ago, I was sitting there outside and I was thinking, this is a bad dream, Am I gonna wake up? It's just
it's hard being away from my family and want to start a family and stuff like that. I want to be free. Yeah, but I want to get my life going. Yeah, it's pretty hard being in here. I got supporters out there. I wanted to thank them, the supporters, and the Lord up above. It's just, I wouldn't be where I'm at, I'd still be in here, but I wouldn't be positive like I am,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still hard after 6.5 years. Biggest thing I miss is watching my little baby brother grow up. It's hard, but I'm surviving day to day.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, suddenly, all these years later, some random guy has information from prison. This murderer sends word by carrier pigeon that he's got some details. But is he for real? Is he credible? Don't prisoners do this type of shit all the time because they're bored? Or is this guy snitching on his friend because he's vindictive? Thank you so much to Jade Frank for her time. Follow us on Instagram, Murder on Ice, and Twitter, Murder on Ice. If you have any information on these crimes, email alaskapodcast@gmail.com or call the police. Follow me on Twitter, the Matt Ralston, and Instagram, the Matt Ralston. Please tell a friend to listen to the show. It'll take you 1 minute to rate and review us on iTunes. It's very important. That's how. Oh, all right. God, this murder stuff is so depressing. Why do people even listen to it? They're so fascinated. I gotta watch something light just to get my mind off it. Let me know if you have any suggestions. I'm thinking maybe Drowning Mona. It's a good movie. All right. Clearly, I'm out. I'll see you next time. Oh yeah, written and produced by me, Matt Ralston. Music by Arla Sanders.